The day Jessica came home was the day Gretchen never did. Both things happened on the same morning, in the same house, to the same family. One daughter arrived, one daughter disappeared. And for the next 50 years, the Harrington family would live inside that impossible contradiction, a day that was supposed to be the happiest of their lives, becoming the one they could never recover from. This is where the story begins. August 15th, 1975. A sunny Friday morning in Broomall, Pennsylvania. In 1975, Broomall was the kind of place where danger felt like something that happened somewhere else. Parents waved goodbye at the front door and expected their kids back at dinner. No phones, no check-ins, no fear. Families had specifically moved here for that feeling, packed up from Philadelphia and settled into these quiet tree-lined streets because their children could breathe here. And for years, nothing had ever given them a reason to doubt it. That morning, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington was getting ready to walk to Bible school. Gretchen was the third of 4 daughters born to Harold and Ina Harrington. Harold was a pastor, steady, devoted, the kind of man whose whole life ran on faith and routine. Ina ran the household, sewed the girls' clothes by hand, kept everything together. They weren't complicated people. They were, by every account, simply good. And Gretchen fit that life perfectly. She was the kind of kid who made friends without trying. Private school classmates, public school neighbors, kids from church. It didn't matter who you were, Gretchen was happy to know you. Her sister Anne said she didn't have a mean streak in her body. Her best friend said they never once fought. They also had one thing she was quietly proud of, a perfect attendance record at Bible school, not a single day missed all week. And this was the last day of the program, the day they handed out the attendance certificates. Now, here is where the morning starts to shift. That same morning, Ina Harrington was being discharged from the hospital. She was coming home with the newest addition to the family, baby Jessica, the 4th Harrington daughter. The whole house was buzzing with anticipation. 12-year-old Zoe and 11-year-old Harriet decided to stay home and wait for their mother. That made sense. That was the obvious choice. And honestly, it would have made sense for Gretchen to stay too. But Harold believed in showing up. He believed in honoring commitments. So he looked at his 8-year-old daughter and told her she should go. Keep the streak. It's less than half a mile. You've walked it every day this week. Gretchen agreed. She picked up her Bible, got dressed, in whatever combination she felt like that morning, stripes with plaid, colors that didn't match, the way she always dressed because she genuinely didn't care, and she headed for the door. Harold stepped outside to watch her go. He kept his eyes on her as she started up the hill on Lawrence Road, moving with purpose, getting smaller as the distance grew. He watched until she was far enough along that everything looked completely fine. Then he went back inside to wait for his wife and his new baby. He didn't know it yet. He couldn't have. But the moment he turned away from that door was the last time he would ever see his daughter alive. At 9:25 a.m., a neighbor spotted Gretchen near the intersection of Lawrence Road and Sussex Boulevard. She was close to the church now, almost there. The neighbor would later describe her as determined and focused, a little girl who knew exactly where she was going. That is the last confirmed sighting of Gretchen Harrington. Somewhere between that intersection and the church, in the final stretch of a walk she had made 4 times that week, something happened. The investigators who came later found no signs of a struggle anywhere along that route, no disturbance in the ground, no trace. The trail simply ended halfway up the hill, as if Gretchen had stepped out of the world entirely. Which means she almost certainly got into a vehicle, without a fight, without a scream, which means she knew the person behind the wheel. Around 11 a.m., a group of Gretchen's friends showed up at the Harrington front door. They were looking for her, assuming she'd come back early. She hadn't. Harold felt the first wave of cold alarm move through him. He called Trinity Church, spoke to the pastor's wife there, asked if anyone had seen Gretchen that morning, if she had made it to class. She hadn't. No one had seen her. Harold searched Lawrence Road himself. He checked nearby streets. He walked toward Darby Creek. He went back toward the church. Nothing. No sign of her anywhere. Then, at 11:23 a.m., someone called the Marple Township Police Department and reported Gretchen missing. The man on the line was someone this community trusted completely. Someone who had no reason, according to his own account, to know what Gretchen Harrington was wearing that morning. He said he hadn't seen her, said she never showed up to camp. But then he described her clothes, in detail. The color of her shorts, the zipper, the snap closure, the pockets on each side, the absence of visible buttons, clothes that Ina had sewn by hand. Details so specific that investigators would quietly circle his name at the top of their list, and then, for reasons that were never fully explained, leave it there for decades without acting on it. Nobody pushed back that day. The search was just beginning. A little girl was missing and everyone needed to move. But that phone call, that one strange, specific, impossible phone call was already the center of everything. It would just take the world 48 years to realize it. By Saturday morning, Broomall had transformed overnight. A town that had never needed to fear anything was now running on pure panic. More than 400 volunteers flooded the streets. Neighbors, firefighters, church members, strangers who had heard the news on the radio and driven in from surrounding areas. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter swept continuously overhead. Canine bloodhound units were deployed. Volunteer firefighters waded through Darby Creek. Search teams pushed through nearly 2 feet of dense underbrush across more than 5 square miles of terrain. They found nothing. But it was the dogs that told the real story. Trained bloodhounds can follow a scent trail across hours, across rain, across difficult terrain. These dogs found nothing past a certain point on Lawrence Road. No trail, no disruption in the ground, no signs of a struggle. No indication that anything had happened there at all. The scent simply stopped. Clean, sudden, final, as if the earth itself had swallowed her. That moment, when the dogs went quiet and stood still on that hill, was the moment the search changed character. This wasn't a child who had wandered off. This wasn't an accident near the creek. Whatever had happened to Gretchen Harrington had happened fast, quietly, and willingly. He had gotten into something, or with someone, without a fight, without a scream, without leaving a single mark on the world to say she had been afraid, which meant she hadn't been afraid. Not at first. Inside the Harrington home, Harold and Ina waited. Baby Jessica, who had come home that same morning full of new life, cried the way newborns cry, thin and insistent, filling every corner of the house. And underneath that sound sat a silence that grew heavier by the hour. One daughter had arrived. One daughter had vanished. The house held both of those truths at the same time and could not make sense of either one. A 24-hour hotline was established. In the first days, it received over 200 calls. And the tips came in fast. A green station wagon seen near a girl close to the church. A battered pickup truck, old and missing its tailgate, parked halfway up the hill toward Trinity Chapel. A white compact car on Lawrence Road. A white 4-door sedan, a young male, a child nearby. The calls kept coming and the picture kept shifting. Too many vehicles, too many descriptions, too many versions of what might have happened, until the weight of conflicting information became its own kind of dead end. But one detail kept returning: the green station wagon. Multiple witnesses, independently, mentioned a green station wagon near a young girl near the church that morning. Not a pickup, not a sedan, a green station wagon. That detail was logged, noted, and then buried under everything else. By Sunday, just 48 hours after Gretchen disappeared, Police Chief Daniel Hennessy stood in front of reporters and said the words that landed like a verdict: "We haven't got a clue, not a lead they couldn't confirm, not a suspect they couldn't pin down, no clues of any kind." The large-scale search was officially called off, and the days that followed were their own kind of horror. August 16th, the streets were quieter than usual. Parents who had let their children roam freely for years were now standing at windows, watching. August 17th, the school year was approaching and nobody knew how to talk to their kids about what had happened. August 18th, the hotline calls were already slowing. The fresh urgency of the first 48 hours was hardening into something more difficult, the long, grinding uncertainty of a case going cold. The town adapted the way frightened communities do, quietly, practically, devastatingly. Karen Frank Zetterberg was a Bible school classmate of Gretchen's, same age, same neighborhood, same tight-knit world. After Gretchen disappeared, Karen's mother took her to the hairdresser and had her long hair cut off, cut short enough that Karen would look like a boy. The thinking was simple and it was heartbreaking. A girl with long hair was a target. Make her look like something else. Change her shape so the danger passes her by. That is what this disappearance did to Broomall. It didn't just frighten parents, it made them start disguising their daughters. On August the 17th, formal witness interviews began, and 2 details emerged that investigators couldn't ignore. First, several witnesses reported seeing a green station wagon stop near a girl close to Trinity Chapel on the morning of August 15th. Second, the camp's usual morning routine had been broken that day. The children had stayed at Trinity Chapel 45 to 50 minutes longer than scheduled, disrupting the normal flow in ways that were still hard to account for. Then came August 19th. A small pair of shorts was found on a fence post in West Chester, Pennsylvania. They weren't Gretchen's, that was confirmed quickly. But the discovery sent investigators back to something that had been quietly sitting in their notes since the very first phone call. The man who had reported Gretchen missing had described her clothing in precise detail. Dark blue shorts, handmade, zipper and snap at the front, pockets on each side, no visible buttons. Those were Ina's stitches. That was Ina's pattern. The kind of detail you carry in your hands, not your memory, because you had been close enough to see it clearly that morning in person. And yet this man had told police he never saw Gretchen that day. He was brought back in on August 19th. He repeated his account without hesitation. He hadn't seen her. She hadn't arrived at camp. He had no explanation for the description. Police let him go. And here is the question that the investigation never properly answered. Why? He had given them a detail he shouldn't have had. The green station wagon witnesses placed a car matching his vehicle near the church. He was one of the last people with reason to be on that road that morning. But he was a pastor, a trusted figure, a man who had called the police himself, who had helped organize the search, whose wife had brought dinner to the Harrington home that same night. In 1975, in a town like Broomall, that kind of standing created a kind of invisible protection, not through corruption or cover-up, but through the simple human inability to point a finger at a man everyone respected. His name stayed on the list. Nothing moved. By the end of September, the hotline had gone silent. The leads had dried up completely, and a case that had consumed an entire community was settling into the cold quiet of the unsolved. Nobody could explain the description of the shorts. Nobody was pressing hard enough to find out. And for 2 more months, that question would sit in the dark, until a jogger in Ridley Creek State Park stopped on a trail, looked down, and saw something that would break this case open and break this community all over again. October in Pennsylvania arrives quietly. The leaves turn. The air goes cold. The parks empty out. And on October 14, 1975, exactly 60 days after Gretchen Harrington walked up a hill and never came back, a Navy seaman was jogging through the trails of Ridley Creek State Park when something made him stop. He wasn't sure what he was looking at. Not at first. The woods were dense here, remote, the kind of place that required real effort to reach, not a casual shortcut, not somewhere you ended up by accident. Whoever had been here had chosen to be here. He looked closer at what was on the ground in front of him. And then he saw something that didn't belong in those woods. He ran to find a park ranger. What investigators found when they arrived at that location would stay with everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. Gretchen's remains were there in a small clearing, 2.5 miles from where she had last been seen alive. 60 days in October woods. The passage of time had taken its toll. There was very little left for investigators to find. But the clothing was still there. And the clothing told a story that nobody could explain. Her blouse, the one Ina had sewn by hand, was folded neatly, placed beside her in a careful pile. Her shoes were on the ground nearby, and her underwear had been hung on a tree branch above the scene. The original 1975 Philadelphia Inquirer described it this way, hung like a flag, as if to call attention to the place. Think about what that means. This was not a crime of pure rage that ended and left nothing behind. Someone had stayed at that scene long enough to arrange things, to fold clothes, to hang something from a branch. Whether it was a ritual, a compulsion, or something else entirely, it pointed to a deliberate mind, someone who felt, in some dark and unreachable part of themselves, that what they were doing had a kind of order to it. That detail would haunt investigators for decades. Harold and Ina Harrington were brought to the police. They were shown the clothing found at the scene. Harold looked at it, the fabric, the stitching, the specific way it had been made, and he said, "There is absolutely no doubt it was hers." Ina had made those clothes with her own hands. She knew every seam. The medical examiner confirmed identification through dental records. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, 2 or more severe impacts to the skull, a depressed fracture, a kind of force that does not happen by accident. Gretchen Harrington had been killed, deliberately, by someone who had then carried her body 2.5 miles into the woods, arranged her clothing with unsettling care, and walked back out into the world. 5 days later, on Sunday, October 19th, Harold Harrington stood at his church pulpit and delivered a sermon. His congregation sat in silence, and Harold, a man who had just identified his 8-year-old daughter through dental records, spoke these words: "Gretchen, with her simple faith, is free, but her killer is in terrible bondage. The world is filled with unspeakable evil because of the wickedness of those who know the truth but will not accept it." He was speaking to his congregation. But those words landed somewhere specific, whether Harold knew it or not. A few days after that, Gretchen's funeral was held. The community came together to say goodbye to a little girl who had loved Gunsmoke and worn mismatched clothes and been everybody's instant friend. It was a grief-filled, quiet service. People wept. People held each other. And at the front of that room, leading the service, offering comfort, praying over Gretchen's coffin, was David Zandstra, the man who, 2 months earlier, had described her handmade shorts in precise detail despite claiming he had never seen her that morning. He stood at that podium and he prayed. He comforted Harold. He comforted Ina. He was the pastor. He was the family friend. He was the man everyone trusted to guide them through their darkest moment. And he did it. He stood there and he did it, while carrying whatever he was carrying inside, and nobody in that room had any reason to look at him differently than they ever had. That is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with, not just what happened to Gretchen in those woods, but what happened after. The composed face at the funeral, the steady voice at the pulpit, the man who helped search for her, who called the police, who brought his wife to deliver dinner to the grieving family, while knowing exactly where she was. The investigation that followed was intense but short-lived. Police interviewed everyone near the area where Gretchen was found. Tips flooded in again. Witnesses reported men of various descriptions in the woods near Ridley Creek. Investigators examined known offenders living in the area. One name kept coming up, a convicted child rapist and kidnapper named Richard Bailey, who had been seen less than a mile from where Gretchen disappeared on the morning she vanished. He was investigated seriously, but his DNA was never compared to evidence from the scene. The case against him never solidified, and Richard Bailey eventually died in a state prison decades later without ever being charged in Gretchen's case. The other leads went the same way. One by one, they dissolved. And the evidence box at Marple Township Police Department headquarters, full of reel-to-reel interview tapes, crime scene photographs, memos, and witness statements, began to gather dust. Detectives would pull it out occasionally. During a slow shift, or when a new officer inherited the case and wanted to start fresh, they would go through the files looking for the thing everyone before them had missed, and they would put it back, frustrated, without finding it. Years passed, then decades. The original lead detective retired, then died. The case moved from desk to desk like something nobody wanted to be responsible for and nobody could bear to let go. Gretchen Harrington remained unsolved. But here is what nobody knew. In a house about 3 miles east of Broomall, a woman had been holding on to something since 1975. Something she had written down as a 10-year-old girl in a childhood diary, in the careful handwriting of someone who knew she had seen something wrong but had no one safe to tell. She had kept that diary for 48 years, and she still had it. Every case on this channel takes weeks of research and long nights, because these stories deserve to be told right. If Gretchen's story moved you, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which part hit you hardest. And if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now let's get back to the case. 47 years is a long time to carry something. Long enough for a community to slowly stop talking about it. Long enough for the detectives who worked the case to retire, grow old, and die. Long enough for the evidence box to gather so much dust that pulling it out felt almost pointless. Long enough for an 8-year-old girl to become a cold case file number instead of a person. But some things refused to stay buried, and in the fall of 2022, something shifted. In October of that year, 2 journalists, Joanna Falcone Sullivan and Mike Mathis, both Broomall natives who had grown up in the shadow of Gretchen's disappearance, published a book about the case. It was called Marple's Gretchen Harrington Tragedy. Sullivan had wanted to write it for decades. She had been 9 years old when Gretchen vanished. She remembered the helicopter flying over the neighborhood. She remembered what it felt like when the streets went quiet. The book wasn't written to sensationalize anything. It was written because someone needed to keep asking the question. And it worked. The book got people talking again. Old memories surfaced, old fears came back up, and somewhere in Pennsylvania a woman read something or heard something that finally pushed her past a line she'd been standing behind for nearly half a century. In the fall of 2022, Sergeant Nick Coffin of the Marple Township Police Department sat down at his desk and found a voicemail waiting for him. A woman wanted to talk about Gretchen Harrington. She said she thought she knew who was responsible. She said she had information about an attempted kidnapping that had happened around the same time. And she said she had kept a diary since 1975. She still had it. Coffin contacted the Pennsylvania State Police, who were the lead investigative agency on the case. On January 2, 2023, state troopers sat down with the woman, identified in court documents only by her initials, SF. She was now in her late 50s. She had lived with what she knew for 48 years, and she had chosen, finally, to say it out loud. SF had grown up in Havertown, about 3 miles from Broomall. She had been a schoolmate of Gretchen and her sister Zoe. She had also been close friends with David Zanstra's daughters, Mara and Kristen. She spent time at the Zanstra home regularly. She slept over there often. And then she told investigators what had happened during 2 of those sleepovers. She was 10 years old. She and Zanstra's daughter had gone to bed. In the middle of the night, she woke up and found David Zanstra in the room, acting inappropriately. He shifted her body and he left immediately, fast, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how to stop. She thought it was strange. She told herself it was nothing, and then it happened again the following night. Same darkness, same movement, same immediate retreat the moment she stirred. The next morning, she told Mara what had happened both nights, and Mara, Zanstra's own daughter, looked at her and said something that SF never forgot. "He does that sometimes. Some nights I hear my sister crying. Sit with that for a moment." A child telling another child that her father's nighttime behavior was so routine, so established, that it had its own quiet acknowledgement in the house. No alarm, no surprise, just a tired, resigned acceptance from a little girl who had learned to sleep lightly. SF went home and told her parents. They banned her from the Zanstra house immediately. No explanations to the outside world, no formal complaint. This was 1975. He was a pastor. He was respected. Who would believe a 10-year-old girl over a man of God? And then, 1 week later, Gretchen Harrington disappeared. SF carried that knowledge from childhood into adolescence, into adulthood, into middle age. She carried it through every development in the case and every decade of silence. She had written it down at the time, had documented her suspicion in the only way a 10-year-old knew how, in her diary. Now she set that diary on the table in front of the state troopers. It was a childhood diary, a kind of object that feels almost too ordinary for what it contained. Worn edges, pages yellowed by 5 decades of time, the careful handwriting of a little girl who was still learning how to form her letters. SF turned to the entry dated September 15, 1975. 1 month after Gretchen vanished, 2 weeks before her body would be found, and she read it aloud. "Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone. But I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z." A 10-year-old girl in 1975, with no forensic training and no detective experience and no power of any kind, had written down the name, in her own private shorthand, of the man she believed had taken her friend. She had written it down because she had no one safe to tell. She had written it down because she had seen something with her own eyes that the entire Marple Township Police Department and the Pennsylvania State Police had missed. She had written it down and then she had kept it. 48 years. In a drawer somewhere, in a box somewhere, in whatever corner of her life she had tucked away the things she couldn't speak out loud. That diary entry was not just a tip. In legal terms, it was a contemporaneous record, written at the time by a witness with direct knowledge, before any arrest, before any trial, before anyone had reason to fabricate anything. It was the kind of evidence that doesn't get created retroactively. A 10-year-old child had documented her suspicion in real time in September of 1975, and that document had survived intact for nearly half a century. The net was closing. Investigators now had a name that matched the car descriptions from 1975, a name that matched the suspicious shorts detail from the original police report, a name attached to a pattern of predatory behavior toward children in the same neighborhood, in the same year, during the same week, and they knew exactly where he was. David Zanstra, 83 years old, retired from ministry, living quietly in a lakefront home in Marietta, Georgia, had no idea that 2 Pennsylvania State Police troopers were about to board a flight south. The question was not whether he had something to hide. The question was whether, after 48 years, he would finally say it out loud. Marietta, Georgia sits northwest of Atlanta, quiet and comfortable, the kind of retirement town where people go to disappear into a slower version of their lives. David Zanstra had been there for years. He and Margaret lived in a lakefront home, peaceful, private, the kind of place that felt very far from a wooded hillside in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. He was 83 years old. He still carried himself like a pastor, still spoke with the measured competence of a man accustomed to being believed. On July 17, 2023, 2 Pennsylvania State Police troopers, Corporal Andrew Martin and Trooper Eugene Trey, flew to Georgia. They came without handcuffs, without weapons drawn. They had arranged to meet Zanstra at the Cobb County Police Department headquarters at his convenience, at a time that worked for him. Their stated primary purpose was simple. They wanted a DNA swab to compare against evidence they were still processing. That was the official reason for the visit. They were careful, deliberate, respectful, two men sitting down with an elderly retired pastor for a conversation. What they were actually doing was closing a door that had been open for 48 years. The interview started the way Zanstra clearly expected it to go. He was sharp, impressively, almost unsettlingly sharp. He recalled the names of churches he had served in the 1960s without hesitation. He named towns, dates, congregation details. He walked the troopers through decades of his life with the ease of a man who had organized his memories carefully and kept them close. At one point, when Corporal Martin got a detail slightly wrong, Zanstra corrected him. He was not a confused old man. He was present. He was in control. And as long as the conversation stayed in his territory, his history, his ministry, his life, he was comfortable. Then Martin shifted the conversation to August the 5th, 1975. The ease evaporated. Zanstra's demeanor changed in a way that was visible but carefully managed. He didn't panic. He leaned slightly on age. "My brain is 83 years old," he said. "You're throwing a lot of stuff at me. You're asking me a lot of questions I'm unsure of." The man who had just corrected a trained detective on a factual detail was now uncertain. The man who could name every church he had served in across 6 decades suddenly couldn't quite place what had happened on a specific morning nearly 50 years ago. He denied seeing Gretchen, denied any involvement. The same account he had given in 1975, in August, in October. She never arrived at camp, he never saw her, he had no idea anything was wrong until Harold called. Martin let him finish. Then he told Zanstra about the woman who had come forward, the childhood friend of his daughter, the sleepovers. What she said had happened in the night, what his own daughter Mara had said in response, and something in David Zanstra's face shifted, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. It was smaller than that, a settling, a slight deflation, as if something he had been holding upright for a very long time had finally gotten too heavy. The religious shield, the composed, trusted, community pillar persona he had maintained for 48 years began to crack along the edges. He started to talk, slowly at first, haltingly, the words coming out of order, circling back, stopping and starting again. He said he saw her that morning, walking up the hill, alone. He recognized her immediately. She was his neighbor's daughter, his daughter's friend, a child he had known for years. He pulled up beside her in his green AMC Rambler station wagon and offered her a ride to church. She accepted without hesitation. Of course she did. She knew him. He did not drive her to church. He drove her to a secluded section of Ridley Creek State Park instead. He parked. He began to make demands that terrified her. She refused. She told him she wanted to go home. He kept her there. She was terrified on that drive, begging him to turn around, to take her back, to let her go. He kept driving. And then, in the confession that Trooper Trey would later say came out of Zanstra with something resembling relief, not remorse, not grief, but relief, Zanstra said he struck her in the head with a rock. He checked for a pulse. He couldn't find one. He covered her body with sticks and branches and left. Then he drove back to the church and went about his day. When the troopers pressed him, why? How could he? What was he thinking? Zanstra reached for the framework his entire life had been built on. He said he was not attracted to little girls anymore. He said that, like King David, his biblical namesake, he had sinned, and now he would confess, and through confession he would find forgiveness, like King David. He had killed an 8-year-old girl, buried her under sticks in a state park, stood at her funeral and prayed over her coffin, spent 48 years watching her family grieve, and he was comparing himself to a biblical king seeking absolution, not broken, not destroyed by guilt, framing his confession as a spiritual transaction. A debt to be settled with God, not with Gretchen. Trooper Trey said afterward that he didn't know if Zanstra was sorry for what he did. What he did know was this: it looked like a weight coming off his shoulders. In the room, everything moved fast after that. Corporal Martin had not come to Georgia with an arrest warrant. Nobody had expected this. Martin had to borrow a laptop from a local Cobb County officer and sit down, right there, to draft the affidavit of probable cause. The man he had flown down to swab for DNA had just confessed to murder. The paperwork that needed to exist did not yet exist. Martin typed while Zanstra sat nearby. David Zanstra was taken into custody that same day, denied bail, held in Cobb County. On July 24, 2023, Delaware County District Attorney Jack Stolzheimer stood at a podium and faced the cameras and said what Broomall had been waiting nearly 5 decades to hear. David Zandstra is every parent's worst nightmare. He killed this poor 8-year-old girl, a girl he knew, a girl who trusted him, and then he acted as if he was a family friend, not only during her burial, but for years. The community exhaled. 48 years of waiting, and the answer had finally come. A confession, an arrest, a trial scheduled. Justice, it seemed, was finally on its way. They had no idea what was coming. The courtroom in January 2025 was quiet in the way that only rooms carrying 50 years of unfinished grief can be. David Zandstra, now 84 years old, sat at the defense table and pleaded not guilty. The same man who had sat in a Georgia police station 18 months earlier and described, in his own words, driving an 8-year-old girl into the woods, was now saying it never happened. That what the troopers had recorded was not a confession. It was a confused old man being pushed past his limits by 2 detectives who had come with an agenda and a plan. Defense attorney Mark Much laid out that argument with precision. His client, Much told the jury, was not a calculating killer who had finally been caught. He was an 83-year-old stroke survivor diagnosed with vascular dementia, a progressive condition that affects memory, judgment, and the ability to resist suggestion. He had been subjected to a 4-hour interrogation in an unfamiliar police building, far from home, with no attorney present. The troopers had come presenting themselves as friendly, as just wanting a conversation, and then had systematically worked to break down an elderly man's sense of reality. And then, Much called Corporal Andrew Martin to the stand. On cross-examination, Martin acknowledged what the defense had been building toward. He had lied to Zandstra during the interview. He told Zandstra that a witness had specifically identified his green Rambler approaching Gretchen on the morning she disappeared. That was not true. Witnesses had reported a Rambler, but none had identified it as Zandstra's. He told Zandstra that police had recovered rocks from the crime scene with blood on them. Also not true. There were rocks. There was no blood. These were interrogation tactics, legal in the United States, commonly used, designed to make a subject believe the evidence against them is stronger than it is. But standing in a courtroom, stated plainly, they sounded like something else. They sounded like 2 detectives constructing a reality around a vulnerable man until he started to believe he belonged inside it. Much looked at the jury and asked a simple question. If David Zandstra had actually killed a child in 1975 and successfully hidden it for 48 years, why would he voluntarily walk into a police interview without a lawyer and talk? Then came the DNA. Forensic testing on Gretchen's clothing had identified biological material belonging to 3 people, 2 unidentified men, 1 unidentified woman. None of them were David Zandstra. He was not a contributor. He was not even a partial match. He was entirely excluded. 3 unknown DNA profiles on the clothing of a murdered 8-year-old girl, still unmatched, still unidentified, belonging to people whose names nobody knows. Much also presented Richard Bailey to the jury, a convicted child rapist and kidnapper who had been seen less than a mile from where Gretchen disappeared on the morning of August 15, 1975. Bailey had been investigated as recently as 2017. His DNA had never been compared to the evidence from Gretchen's case. He had died in state prison in the 1990s, and whatever he knew had died with him. The prosecution pushed back. Deputy District Attorney Jeff Payne told the jury that Zandstra had recalled details during his confession that only the killer could have known, including the fact that Gretchen had been terrified on the drive that she had begged him to take her home, that he had struck her with a rock and covered her with branches. Details, Payne argued, that don't come from suggestion, details that come from memory. But the damage was done. On January 17, 2025, the jury began deliberating. 1 hour later, they came back. Not guilty on all counts. David Zandstra stood up from the defense table and hugged his attorney. His family, who had been waiting through 18 months of hearings and continuances and motions, gathered around him. After a 4-day trial and 48 years of questions, he was going home. D.A. Payne stood at a microphone afterward and said his office believed Zandstra was the correct suspect, that it had been a difficult case from the start, with witnesses unavailable and evidence degraded by time, that they respected the jury's decision. Gretchen's family said nothing publicly. There was nothing left to say. Broomall had waited 50 years for a verdict. They got one. It just wasn't the one anyone had been waiting for. David Zanstra returned to his lakefront home in Georgia. He had spent 18 months in custody. While he was there, his cancer, which had been in remission, came back. It went untreated during his time in prison, and within months of returning home, David Zanstra was dead. He was 85 years old. His family filed a federal lawsuit in January 2026, naming Corporal Andrew Martin and Trooper Eugene Trey as defendants. The lawsuit alleged that the investigators had illegally coerced a confession from a stroke survivor whose cancer returned and went untreated while he was wrongfully incarcerated. The plaintiff was Margaret Zanstra, the same woman who had brought dinner to the Harrington home on the night Gretchen disappeared. Now she was filing paperwork on behalf of her husband's estate, seeking damages for what she called an extreme and immoral prosecution. The man who confessed is dead. The alternate suspect died in prison decades ago. The 3 DNA profiles on Gretchen's clothing remain unmatched in any database. The Pennsylvania State Police have said the investigation is closed. There are no announced plans to reopen it. And Gretchen Harrington remains, officially, an unsolved case. She never got her perfect attendance certificate. That was what she was walking toward that morning, a small piece of paper that recognized the fact that she had shown up every single day without fail. She was 8 years old, Bible in hand, striped shirt with plaid pants because she never cared about matching, moving up that hill with the kind of certainty that only children who feel completely safe can have. 50 years later, 3 unknown DNA profiles sit in a database with no names attached. A diary written by a 10-year-old girl was the closest thing to justice this case ever produced, and somewhere in Ridley Creek State Park in the memory of everyone who was there in October 1975. A piece of clothing still hangs from a tree branch like a flag, exactly the way the newspaper described it, as if calling attention to a place where someone left a child and walked away and has never once been held accountable. If you know anything about what happened to Gretchen Harrington, the Pennsylvania State Police tip line is still active. The number is 600-579-8429. Justice, as someone once said, does not have an expiration date, but for Gretchen, it is running very, very late. Before you go, think about these questions and leave your answer in the comments below. The DNA found on Gretchen's clothing belonged to 2 unknown men and 1 unknown woman. None of them Zanstra. Who do you think those 3 people are, and why has no one been identified after 50 years? David Zanstra described Gretchen's handmade clothes in precise detail on the day she disappeared, clothes he claimed he never saw. If he was truly innocent, how do you explain that? A jury took 1 hour to acquit him. 1 hour after a 4-day trial and a recorded confession. Do you think justice was served that day? Or did it walk out of that courtroom in handcuffs 18 months too late?